Okay. Okay. There we go. Okay. So, like I said, we'll break down civil liberties, start to today, and talk quite a bit about the First Amendment. Okay. So what are civil liberties? Essentially, they're the balance between what the government is allowed to do and what it's not allowed to do. So it's that balance between the power the government has and the necessary restraints on government power to keep them from interfering in our basic rights. So civil liberties are essentially protection from the government. And the problem with civil liberties is it's a bit of a catch-22. Have any of you read the book Catch-22 or are familiar with the idea? Okay, essentially a catch-22 is you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. So in terms of civil liberties, the catch-22 is the government has to be kept in check, but they also have to have enough power to protect us from foreign threats, from terrorism, mass violence, and so on. So it's a very fine line between government power and government restraint. And that line has obviously become blurred in the post-9/11 era. We've seen a lot more restrictions on civil liberties in the name of national security. So that line becomes very complicated, very blurred between the two. And there was some debate about whether or not the Bill of Rights should even be included in the Constitution. Some of the founding fathers said, there's already protections in place, and the others said we need to make it absolutely clear what rights citizens have or don't have. So of course they incorporated the Bill of Rights as the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. And a fundamental civil liberty that we have pretty much always had is the right of habeas corpus. You can't imprison someone without trying them. So you can't throw someone in jail indefinitely on a murder charge. You can't lock someone up for 8 years on a shoplifting charge, which actually happened recently in Louisiana. You have to try someone. If you don't have the proof, you have to let them go. So you cannot detain someone indefinitely. We have the right to a trial, to be told what the charges are, and to hear the evidence against us. That is a fundamental civil liberty. Habeas corpus also gets into the discussion of no body, no proof, right? It's harder to prove someone's been murdered if you don't have the body. So a kind of weird example of this is a man named Robert Durst, who's the subject of a documentary called The Jinx. And he'd been accused of murdering his neighbor here in Texas and then dismembering his body. But because they never found all of the body parts, they could never try him for murder because they couldn't determine the cause of death. He argued it was self-defense, and there was no way to prove otherwise. So all they charged him with was illegal disposal of a body. If the proof isn't there, then either they can't go forward with the trial or they have to figure out different charges. So they can't just throw you in jail on a trumped-up charge and leave you there indefinitely. That is a fundamental civil liberty that is written into Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution. You have the right to know what you're being charged with and to be brought before a judge and charged and go forward with a trial date. Okay, so originally the Supreme Court only applied the Bill of Rights on the federal level. So we were only protected from federal government overreach, not state government. Eventually, the Supreme Court did say that the 14th Amendment is protection against state violations of civil liberties or civil rights. So it took until the 14th Amendment at the end of the Civil War for it to be made clear that the Bill of Rights limits both the federal government and the state government. That we have the fundamental rights in the Constitution at every level. And the 14th Amendment was first applied to the states in the form of eminent domain. Eminent domain is when the government tries to take your property and then has to justify doing so. And we'll discuss eminent domain in more detail later. But even though we had these fundamental rights, even though they were clearly outlined, they weren't actually put into place until about 100 years ago. The Supreme Court didn't say that free speech is a fundamental right until 1925. That we had freedom of the press until 1931, and the right to assembly in 1939. And it wasn't until the 1960s that we got protections like the right to a lawyer and the right to remain silent. So these rights that we see as fundamental and take somewhat for granted aren't that old. They haven't been part of our history for a very long time. We're talking 50 years in some cases. So it hasn't been that long. And what ended up happening was it became clear that the protections in the Bill of Rights had to be incorporated into the states. But the states were picking and choosing what protections they put into the state constitution. There were some protections here, but not others. And so eventually what happened is the 14th Amendment said, you can't pick and choose which parts of the Constitution you're going to enforce. Every protection in the Bill of Rights has to exist on the state as well as the federal level. So they put an end to the practice of selective incorporation. They said, you have the right to be protected not only from the federal government, but from the state government. So if a Texas Highway Patrol officer pulls you over and searches your car without a warrant, that's a violation of your civil liberties. The protections given to us in the Bill of Rights exist on the federal level, the state level, and the local level. So we are protected from all levels of government intruding or violating our basic fundamental civil liberties. All right, so before we move on, I'm just going to do a quick test of your knowledge of the Bill of Rights. Okay, what does the First Amendment give us? What are the freedoms in the First Amendment? Speech, religion, assembly. Okay, what about the Second Amendment? Yep, Second Amendment gives us the right to bear arms. Third Amendment. And most students don't know the Third Amendment because it's very rarely applied. The Third Amendment says that you can't be forced to quarter or basically house soldiers during peacetime. That's the result of the British Empire. So during peacetime, you can't be forced to allow soldiers to stay in your home. What about the Fourth Amendment? Okay, Fourth Amendment protects us from illegal search and seizure, requires a warrant to search your house, for example. What about the Fifth Amendment? Okay, Fifth Amendment gives us the right to remain silent, protects us from double jeopardy, self-incrimination. You can't be forced to reveal something at the trial that would incriminate yourself. Exactly. Yep, that's exactly where it comes from. Yep, you have the right to plead the Fifth. Yep. What about the Sixth Amendment? Okay, the Sixth Amendment gives us the right to a lawyer in a trial. Seventh Amendment gives us the right to a trial by jury in civil cases. So if you're involved in a civil lawsuit, you can ask for a jury trial, not just a bench trial. The Eighth Amendment gives us protection from cruel and unusual punishment. For example, you can't execute someone for the crime of shoplifting. And if you do apply the death penalty, it has to be in a manner that's not unbelievably cruel. The Ninth Amendment basically says, even if a right's not listed here, that doesn't mean we don't have the right. The Ninth Amendment basically says we have other rights that aren't listed here. And the 10th Amendment gives the rights to the states. Basically says if it's not given to the federal government, it's reserved for the states. So these are the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, and ones that, of course, protect us from government overreach. Next week is Constitution Week, so I'll be handing out pocket copies of the Constitution in class, but this is my pocket copy from the ACLU. It not only has the Constitution, there's also a section in the back on what to do if you get pulled over by the cops, if they want to question you. So basically your civil rights or your civil liberties. And it's important to know these things. If you go to a protest, you should know what your rights are. If you get pulled over by the cops, you should know what your rights are. If you're detained, you should know what your rights are. Okay, so we're going to break down the First Amendment today because there's a lot of different parts to it, a lot of different components. And part of the First Amendment, of course, is freedom of religion. And it gets a little controversial because there is what's called the Establishment Clause. What this says is that the government cannot establish an official church or an official religion. This was done because in England, the king or queen was part of the Church of England. They were the head of the church, and there was an official religion. Fleeing persecution, the founding fathers said there will be no official church and no official religion. So when people talk about how we're a Christian nation, not officially, right? There is no official religion in the United States. And that's also, of course, led to debate over the separation between church and state. And it was Thomas Jefferson who said that the government can't promote religion, that it has to be secular in its approach. So this gets into the question of where's the line between religion and government? What is the government allowed to do, and what is it not allowed to do? So for quite a while, basically there was no real discussion. And then eventually the courts decided we need to make sure education is secular. So they struck down school prayer policies like Bible readings in public schools, reciting a prayer over the loudspeaker at a football game. Things like that have been struck down by the Supreme Court because it can be seen as establishing a religion. If you are, for example, a Jewish or Muslim student in a school where there's Bible readings, you're going to feel a bit left out, perhaps being bullied. So the idea is schools can't promote religion. Public schools. Private schools, if it's a Catholic school, obviously that's different. But public schools aren't allowed to have Bible readings at the beginning of homeroom, recitation of prayer over the loudspeaker. That's not allowed. I know here in Texas there's a moment of silence at the end of the pledges for a moment of silent prayer. That's allowed because, of course, you can pray or not depending on your beliefs. And the government, through the Lemon test, is given some flexibility on particular actions. Essentially, the government can provide some form of aid to a religious school as long as their aid is secular in purpose and there's no entanglement of the government and religion. Yes?
Going back to the prayer in the school, has there been any debate about the pledge of allegiance since it is under God?
Yeah.
Since most students, pretty much any school district requires you to pledge allegiance.
Yeah. There has been some debate. There's been some atheist challenges to it. Interestingly enough, the phrase "under God" wasn't in the Pledge of Allegiance originally. It was added in the 1950s in response to the so-called godless communists. So it wasn't originally in the Pledge of Allegiance. And there have been challenges, but the Supreme Court has said it doesn't specify which God, so it's allowed. Also, you can't require students to recite the Pledge of Allegiance, and we'll get into that in a minute, but if a student doesn't want to because of religious reasons, you can't force them to recite the Pledge of Allegiance. So the phrase "under God" is allowed because it doesn't specify which God. Atheists don't like it, they've challenged it, but for now it's allowed to stay. Yeah. So in terms of religion in schools, we have an after-school Bible club. A student can bring a Bible and read it in the class. Colleges are allowed to have religious student groups like Hillel, which is a Jewish organization, or Christian student clubs. They're allowed because they're essentially not promoted by the college, not promoted by the school. They're given funding like any other student organization, but you can't be forced to join it. And if you open the door for every religious club on campus to exist, then it's fine. You can't have a Christian club and ban others, but if you say, okay, we'll allow a Christian student club, a Muslim student club, a Hindu student club, then it's fine. And it's also why high schools can have after-school Bible readings, because it's voluntary. You don't have to take part in that. We've also seen some debate about displaying the Ten Commandments in public. So there's been 2 Supreme Court cases looking at this. The first one was here in Texas, the Van Orden case. The Ten Commandments were part of a larger display outside of the state capitol building. And because it's part of a larger display that includes the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, it's allowed to stay there because it's part of an inclusive display. In the ACLU case in Kentucky, they were displaying the Ten Commandments inside the courthouses on their own as a religious symbol. And that was struck down because they said that's clearly trying to establish one religion. It's not part of a larger display. They got told they had to take it down. In Oklahoma, there was a case where they put up the Ten Commandments in the state capitol, and the local satanic temple responded by putting up a statue of Satan outside the state capitol. And they were told to take it down, and they sued, and the court said, you've opened the door for this. If you allow one religious display, you have to allow others. So they had two choices: take down the Ten Commandments or leave the satanic statue up. So you open the door for one religion to be displayed, you open the door for all the others. You don't get to pick and choose. Okay, also in terms of religion, there is the free exercise clause in the First Amendment. We are allowed to believe and practice the religion of our choice. We can wear a crucifix, a yarmulke, a hijab, a pentacle. That is our right. We have the right to believe and practice whatever religion we happen to subscribe to. And so we've seen some issues around free exercise. Jehovah's Witnesses, in their religion, they are not allowed to pledge allegiance to a nation. It's just part of the religion. They cannot pledge allegiance to a nation. And during the Holocaust, around 10,000 Jehovah's Witnesses were murdered for refusing to pledge allegiance to Nazi Germany. Here in the U.S., Jehovah's Witnesses children were being expelled from school for refusing to recite the Pledge of Allegiance. And the Supreme Court stepped in and said, you can't do that. If a student has a religious objection, you cannot force them to recite the Pledge of Allegiance. So you can ask students to do it, but if a student refuses, you cannot punish them for refusing to recite the Pledge of Allegiance, especially if they have a religious exemption. We've also seen issues with freedom of religious exercise for Muslim Americans. Now, they are a very small percentage of the population, statistically speaking, but they have faced issues of the Holt case. A prisoner in Arkansas wanted to grow a beard because in Islam, men are strongly encouraged to grow a beard. But the prison had a policy that no one was allowed to have facial hair. So he sued and won. The Supreme Court said that's an example of religious exercise. He has to be allowed to grow a beard. You have to get rid of this policy. The other major case was when the EEOC, which is the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, sued Abercrombie and Fitch. They refused to hire a woman who wears a hijab. In Islam, there are three major coverings for women. The hijab is the scarf that covers the hair and part of the neck. Then you have the niqab, which covers basically the entire face, leaving an opening for the eyes. And then you have the third kind, and I'm blanking on the name of it, that basically covers the entire face, and there's like a screen so women can see out. Bless you. That was required in Afghanistan. Most Muslim women in the U.S. just wear the hijab, the head covering. So the store refusing to hire a woman who would cover her hair. They said it was a violation of the company's dress code. She sued and won. The company was told That's religious discrimination. If she wears a hijab as part of her religious exercise, you cannot prevent her from doing so. And in a more funny example, there's a church called the Church of the Flying Spaghetti Monster. Swear to God, it's real, Church of the Flying Spaghetti Monster. And the members call themselves Pastafarians. So in some states, they've wanted the right to wear a colander, like a pasta drainer, on their heads for their driver's license photos. And they've won the right to do so as part of their religion. They also have to get married in the church dressed like pirates. Religious exercise, right? If you allow it for one, you have to allow it for everyone. So the Pastafarians can wear a colander on their head in a driver's license photo.
What is that?
Okay, let me see if I can. Basically, like that. Yeah. Yeah. And actually, I can show you the Church of the Flying Spaghetti Monster. Let me see if I can find it. There we go. Not Wikipedia. There we go. Church of the Flying Spaghetti. No, not what I wanted to do. Okay, let me go back. There we go. Okay. Let me share it with the students on. Go back. Yeah. Okay. This is the Church of the Flying Spaghetti Monster. Yes.
I love that.
Yeah. And they say things like touched by his nudely appendage. Yep. And you get ordained as a Pastafarian minister.
Oh, wow.
Yep. Yeah. So there's all this information. Essentially, it started off kind of as a joke, kind of a pushback against religious fundamentalism. And then it actually kind of grew into an organized church. Yeah. Yeah. Uh-huh. Yeah. Yep. There you go. Church of the Flying Spaghetti Monster. And I love the section that's entitled Hate Mail. I don't even know what's... Yeah. And it had, when the website was first getting started, because I was actually kind of paying attention to it, when the website first got started, people would post things like, you're all going to hell, so they'd write back, we'll roast pineapples on the coals or something like that. I mean, they're allowed to practice their religion, right? I mean, the idea is they leave you alone and then they just do their own thing. Yeah. So, Church of Flying Spaghetti Monster. Gotta love it. Okay. In terms of freedom of speech, again, this one gets kind of controversial, right? Because on the one hand, we don't want to censor speech. On the other hand, where do we draw the line between free speech and hate speech? So essentially, the burden of proof is on the government to determine if something should be allowed or not. We don't have to prove it's free speech. They have to prove it's not. So the burden of proof isn't necessarily on us. It's on the government. Now, the Supreme Court has said there is a test that is allowed by the government. It's called the clear and present danger test. If someone says something that is so outrageous, so incendiary that it presents a clear danger to society, it is not protected. This is what they call the shouting fire in a crowded theater test, right? If you shout fire in a movie theater packed to capacity, and there's not really a fire and a stampede breaks out, you've caused physical harm, right? So an example of this is if you're at the airport and you say TSA sucks, that's protected speech. But if you yell, I have a bomb, and you don't, or you do, and there's a panic and people get injured, that's not protected speech, right? Because you're essentially inciting panic or potential violence. So it's not protected if it actually incites violence. If you threaten to kill the president on Twitter, you better believe law enforcement's going to knock on your door, right? You can't say things like that. But the courts have also said that unless speech does actually incite violence, it is protected. So the Brandenburg case there was a KKK leader who was speaking at a rally and essentially said, we have to take action against the federal government if they keep suppressing the white race. Now, he didn't have a gun on him, but his followers did. So he was arrested for inciting violence, but the court said he didn't actually incite violence. He just said take action. That could be anything from protests, non-violent opposition. So he wasn't directly inciting violence. If he had said, if the government keeps this up, we should kill them, that's different. But simply saying we have to take action doesn't incite violence. So unless they're directly advocating violence, it is free speech. It's protected. We've also seen an increase in the idea of free speech with campaigns. It used to be the case that you couldn't mention the opposition candidate 60 days before an election. That's been tossed out. Also, with Citizens United, essentially what the court said was corporations are people in terms of free speech, so you cannot ban political donations from corporations. So essentially they've opened the door for massive amounts of money to be spent on elections. It's why Mitt Romney and Barack Obama spent something like $4 billion in the 2012 election. And in 2016, between August and November, Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump spent a combined $1 billion in that 3-month cycle alone. Yeah. Essentially, nowadays, to be perfectly blunt, it basically, you almost have to be a millionaire to run for office, or you've got to be very good at fundraising, one or the other. Okay, fighting words get a little controversial. If it directly incites violence, depends, right? If you walk up to a cop and you call him a pig and he punches you, is that protected speech? Yeah, because it shouldn't have incited violence in response. Obscenities can't be banned either. You can't go up to someone in public who's saying fuck repeatedly and arrest them for that. It's protected speech. Obscenities are protected. It gets tricky when we deal with the issue of language that's offensive to minorities. Essentially, it is protected, right? If someone walks up to an African American man in Walmart and calls him the N-word, you can't be arrested for that. Will it likely cause So, possibly a physical fight or some kind of outrage, yeah. But can they be arrested for that? No. So it gets a little tricky, right, on the idea of hate speech. It can get a little bit complicated. Now, if you are using speech to sexually harass someone, that is absolutely not protected. Sexual harassment can be verbal as well as physical. So if you are telling an employee, you have to sleep with me or you're fired, that's not protected. Or you comment on someone's physical appearance, that's not protected. You will get into trouble for that. Because obviously that's um, not geared to be helpful in any way, shape, or form. So sexual harassment is not protected speech. We've also seen a reluctance by the court, the Supreme Court, to put a ban on hate speech. In the RAV case, what happened was there were a group of young men who were burning crosses on the lawns of the homes of African Americans. And so the city passed a law saying you can't burn crosses. And the Supreme Court said you can't do that. You can't prohibit an action that's only directed at certain groups. So you can't ban cross burning. You can't ban, I don't know, throwing pork at a Muslim mosque. You can obviously go after them if they do something like set fire to the mosque or graffiti it or something like that, but by and large, hate speech is broadly protected by the courts, unless it's directly inciting violence or it's so fundamentally outrageous, the courts aren't really going to do anything about it. It is considered protected by the First Amendment.
There's nothing pretty much cross-burning, let's say, at my house. I call the cops and this person is my neighbor. I can't do anything. There's nothing.
What
to do if it escalates?
So-
Then we will do something.
Yeah, so what they can do is they can arrest them for intimidation or destruction of property, but they can't charge them with like an additional crime for burning a cross on your lawn. They can still face a criminal penalty for trespassing or destruction of property, arson, but they can't charge them with like a hate crime on top of that. Yeah. Okay. The book doesn't talk about student rights, which I think is a bit of an oversight. In the Tinker case, what happened was there was a family in Des Moines. The children would wear a black armband with a peace sign on it to protest the Vietnam War. And they were essentially told, you have to stop wearing this or we will suspend you. And so they sued, and the Supreme Court said high school students do have the right to some expression of free speech. If they want to wear an armband, they can. If they want to wear a political t-shirt, they can. The right to free speech doesn't necessarily end at the schoolhouse door. So you can wear a button as long as it's not obscene. You can wear a Trump 2020 or a Biden t-shirt. You can wear a black armband to protest violence. You can wear a Black Lives Matter t-shirt. High school students do have some rights to free speech. They are somewhat protected by the First Amendment. Now, they're not allowed to advocate for drug use, like the kids who put up the banner saying "Bong hits for Jesus." No, you can't do that. Yeah, not very smart because obviously, yeah. And you can't make sexually suggestive speech, right? Because, yeah, I mean, but by and large, they do have the right to some expression of free speech, to protest, to walk out of class in protest of gun violence. After the shooting in Parkland, Florida, at that high school, a lot of students did a walkout to protest gun violence, and that was allowed. You cannot give them detention, suspend, or expel a student for exercising their First Amendment rights. In terms of commercial speech, obviously we don't see ads for tobacco on television or in newspapers anymore, although they used to be prominent. Magazines, though, can run an ad for cigarettes or smokeless tobacco, things like that. Also alcohol, right? Magazines can accept ads for Smirnoff or whatever, that's allowed. Newspapers didn't used to be allowed to run business ads for dentists or doctors or hairdressers. Obviously now they can. And the interesting one is when Roe v. Wade was passed and abortion became legal, abortion providers wanted to be able to advertise in phone books and newspapers. Originally they weren't allowed to, and then the court said it's a legal service, they have the right to run an ad. So they can run an ad in a newspaper or be listed in the phone book if someone's looking for information on how to obtain an abortion. So commercial speech is also pretty broadly protected. Okay. Symbolic speech is also pretty largely protected. In the 1980s, in the Texas v. Johnson case, at the 1984 Republican National Convention in Texas, protesters burned a flag in opposition to the Reagan administration and were arrested for this. And the Supreme Court said flag burning is protected by the First Amendment. It's considered symbolic speech. So you do have the right to burn a flag in protest. Congress tried to circumvent that by proposing a constitutional amendment to ban flag burning, but it's never really gotten off the ground, and it would likely be overturned by the Supreme Court anyway because they've said it's a constitutionally protected right. So if you go to a protest and someone burns a flag, you can't be arrested for that. You probably don't want to film it and incite some kind of reaction, but you are allowed to burn a flag in protest. You're also allowed to take part in things like picketing or protests. In the Snyder case, the Westboro Baptist Church, and I use the term church very lightly here to refer to this group, they're known for going to the funerals of soldiers and holding up signs that say things like, "Thank God for dead soldiers," "God hates fags," "Soldiers have HIV," really offensive things. They'll also go to the funerals of young LGBT people who are killed for being gay, like Matthew Shepard. They were going to show up to protest after the Pulse nightclub shooting and got talked out of it because that would not have gone over very well. And it's considered protected speech because they aren't directly inciting violence. If something happens they're not the ones to start it. They have lawyers in their church, which is basically one big family in Kansas. So they're very careful to follow the law. And so the Supreme Court has said, yeah, it's offensive, but we can't restrict their right to protest. As long as they're following the law, we can't do anything about it. And speech plus is also protected. Picketing, protest of some kind, doing what's called a die-in, where people lie on the ground like dead bodies. That's protected as well. Picketing outside an abortion clinic, that's also allowed. Now, there are some restrictions on this. You can't protest on private property unless you get permission from the property owner. You can't protest outside a shopping mall unless you get permission. You can also be denied the right to assemble on safety grounds. That first white supremacist march that went through Virginia and led to the young woman being killed, when they went back the next year, the state said absolutely not. You guys were violent, someone died, we are not going to allow this. So if they're worried that it could cause riots, violence, they're not going to allow it. And there are some restrictions on protesting outside abortion clinics. Like, they're not allowed within 10 feet of the front doors. They're not supposed to physically grab the women coming in and out of the clinic. They'll yell things at them, but they're not allowed to grab them, try to force them not to go inside. But it does get a bit contentious. Someone who's going into Planned Parenthood for birth control being called a baby killer, that's a little unsettling. So most clinics do have volunteers who help walk them through the corridor of protesters to keep them from trying to go in on their own and being intimidated. So it's allowed, but there are restrictions on what they're allowed to do in terms of being able to protest. And more often than not, when the Westboro Baptist Church shows up, there's always counter-protesters. When the Westboro Baptist Church showed up for Matthew Shepard's funeral, he was the young man in Laramie, Wyoming, who was beaten and left tied to a fence and died in 1998. They were going to show up carrying signs that said things like, Matthew Shepard entered hell, and the date of his death. So a whole bunch of counter-protesters showed up wearing great big angel's wings and formed a barrier around the family so they didn't have to see the signs. So for every protest, usually you get a counter-protest of some kind. You get both sides kind of showing up. And we're seeing this with the Black Lives Matter protests, right? We're seeing most of them are peaceful. Some of them have gotten a little or a lot out of hand. The first protest that was supposed to happen in McAllen, there was a guy with a chainsaw who went running through the protesters. That was nuts. But the second protest in Edinburgh, there weren't any problems. It was peaceful. People were pretty good about it. There weren't really any issues. So some of them have been fine and some of them not. All right, so the last protection in the First Amendment is freedom of the press. And essentially, what the court has said is that you can't prevent a newspaper from publishing what they want unless it's extraordinary circumstances. Like, if a newspaper wanted to publish the details of where we would be bombing next in Afghanistan, probably not going to be allowed. If they want to publish a story on the war, the government can't prevent them from doing so. So the press has the right to publish information that is considered necessary for the American people. And the major test of this was in the 1970s with the Pentagon Papers. The Pentagon Papers were State Department documents and Defense Department documents illegally given to the New York Times that showed that the death toll in Vietnam was higher than the government was reporting, that the war was not going as well as they thought it would, and that we were going to start bombing Cambodia. So the Nixon administration was like, oh, we don't want the public to know this. So they tried to ban the New York Times from publishing, and the Supreme Court said the people have a right to know. The people have a right to know what the government is doing. So the Pentagon Papers were published by the New York Times and the Washington Post, and the American people learned how much the government had been lying to them. And it was really Vietnam and Watergate that led to the huge decline in trust for our government. Finding out the government had been lying to us for years, it was quite of a shock to people. Yes? Okay, so Watergate was when President Nixon ordered basically illegal wiretap on the Democratic Party, and then the people who broke into wiretap got caught. And then they found out that Nixon was also illegally recording conversations in the Oval Office, talking about how we're going to go after this guy, we're going to shut this down, essentially engaging in bribery, corruption, major violations of the law. And he ended up resigning because otherwise Congress would have impeached him, because he broke the law in almost every way he could. Yeah. Okay, so while the press has the right to publish, there aren't that many protections for journalists. Nowhere in the Constitution is there a protection for a journalist. Newspapers are protected, magazines are protected, the writers, not so much. So it becomes a bit of an issue when we're talking about the idea of confidential sources. Newspapers rely on confidential sources to get important information. When the news about Watergate broke, it was because two journalists at the Washington Post had a confidential source who gave them the information. And that source turned out to be someone at the FBI. The journalists, if someone says, I do not want to be identified, will offer confidentiality to a source. However, if they are ordered to reveal who that person is by the court and they refuse, they will go to jail. If they are ordered to reveal information to the court and they refuse, they will go to jail. So a more recent example of this is the scandal around a woman named Valerie Plame. Valerie Plame was an undercover CIA operative. Her husband was a member of Congress. Her husband spoke out against the war in Iraq and criticized the Bush administration. A member of the administration then leaked to a reporter Valerie Plame's undercover identity and her work for the CIA. She could have been killed. They had to pull her from the field immediately. So naturally, they wanted to know who put her life in danger, right? Who told the reporter this? So the reporter went to jail for a little bit and then eventually revealed it was a man named Scooter Libby, who then went to jail himself for revealing confidential information. So something like that, there's no protection, right? They have to say who their source is. Because obviously, if she'd been killed, that would have been really, really bad. There are protections for whistleblowers. So if someone is revealing information, like today there was an article saying that the State Department was asking people to hide information about foreign interference in the 2016 election, inflate numbers on terrorism and things like that. So that whistleblower was originally protected and now has revealed his identity. So for something like that, usually the journalists are allowed to keep their identity hidden. We didn't know the name of the journalist source for Watergate until the late 1990s. His undercover name was Deep Throat, and nobody knew for sure who he was until he revealed his identity shortly before he died. So in some cases, there's protection for sources, and others, not so much. Okay, so some of the other limits we see on the freedom of press include libel and slander. Libel is when a journalist writes something that is damaging to a person. For libel to be proven, not only does the story have to be false, but they have to prove that the journalist knew the story was false. So for example, when a tabloid published an article saying Melania Trump had been a call girl without any verification, they got sued. It can be hard to prove libel because you have to prove that the journalist knew the information was wrong. If they write an article in good faith and they find out later the information they were given was false, that's not libel. So you have to prove that they knew the information was not true. There's also an issue with slander. Basically, if you say something denigrating to a person, technically you can be sued for that, but how do you prove it, right? Unless there's an audio recording proving someone said something is incredibly difficult. You just get into a he said argument. So unless it's recorded somewhere, proving slander is very, very difficult. We've also seen some issues with third-party posting. Platforms like Reddit or Amazon or other websites are protected from lawsuits if someone goes after them for something someone posted. They're not essentially able to be held responsible for anything that's published by a person on their website. So an example of this is there used to be a website called Backpage that allowed sex workers to offer their services online rather than be out on the streets. But sex traffickers were offering underage girls on Backpage for sale, and when some of these girls were rescued, they tried to sue Backpage for facilitating their sex trafficking, and the court said, you can't hold Backpage responsible for what your traffickers did to you. Backpage did try to put in some more protections and was eventually taken down. But they couldn't go after the company that hosted the website because Congress has said you can't sue them for something that's posted by someone else. Backpage didn't sell you, your traffickers did, so you can't go after Backpage. In terms of pornography, it's best said by a Supreme Court justice when asked to define it, he said, I know it when I see it. There's no real standard definition of pornography. We know it when we see it. Now, you cannot ban the sale of adult books or adult pornography. The limits are in place on things like child pornography or snuff films. A snuff film is where someone is killed on camera. That's not legal, right? So, yeah, there's a lot of crazy shit on the internet. Trust me, so if someone publishes a snuff film or child pornography, obviously that's illegal. They can go after them. But if it's two consenting adults, you can't do anything about it. It's protected. You can ban the sale of violent video games, somewhat in that you can put an age restriction on like Grand Theft Auto and say you have to be 18. But you can't ban the sale of violent video games outright. So there's some limits in terms of like age restrictions, but otherwise, if it's two consenting adults or you make sure the kid's 18 when they buy Grand Theft Auto, there's not much you can do about that. Yeah, and there's a really interesting documentary on Netflix called Don't Fuck with Cats, and it's about this group of citizen journalists, this sociopath, psychopath in Canada had posted a video of him killing kittens, which of course nobody's gonna write. Everybody's really pissed off about that. So they tried to track the guy down, and he posted a couple more videos of him killing animals, and then he moved on to killing a person and then filming it and putting it online. And the citizen journalists were actually able to track him down, and he was finally arrested and went to jail. But yeah, there's a lot of, as we know, a lot of really dark stuff out there. And they try to track it as best they can, but you can't catch everything, right? So, yeah. Okay. Any questions, comments? Okay. So next day we'll wrap up chapter 4. We'll talk about freedom from search and seizure and so on. So next Tuesday, of course, you guys will be online, and the other half will be in class. Next Thursday is Constitution Day. The Political Science Department will have free pocket copies of the Constitution that we'll be handing out to you guys next week. So I'll try to give them to students on Tuesday and Thursday. That way you guys also have a copy of the Constitution on hand. And if you have any questions,